Once you understand what really changes at 59 and a half, a lot of you are going to realize something that feels almost dangerous to say out loud. You may already have the right to stop working full time without blowing up your retirement if you are somewhere between your late 50s and early 60s, and you still have this automatic picture in your head that says, I work until 65 because that is what responsible people do. I want to interrupt that picture immediately because for many people that plan is not discipline anymore. It is inertia. There is a quiet moment that sneaks up on people around 57, 58, 59. They open the 401k statement. They look at the IRA. They look at the brokerage account. They stare at the mortgage balance that is smaller than it used to be. The kids are older. The spending is different. And for the first time, the question in their head shifts. It stops being, do I have enough? It becomes, why am I still working this hard? And then the more uncomfortable version arrives, do I actually still need to? Most people do not keep working past that moment because they have carefully run the numbers and concluded there is no alternative. Most keep working because nobody ever explained how different the rules become once you cross 59 and a half, and how much control that age can give you over your taxes, your withdrawals, your timetable, and your life. That is the part I want to fix here. I want to show you why 59 and a half is not just another birthday. I want to show you why retirement income is not the same as paycheck income, why working too long can carry real tax costs and real life costs, why fear around health insurance and not enough is often badly framed, and how to think through the next step without using guesswork as your strategy. And I want you to stay with me all the way through because by the end I am going to give you one question, just one. But it is the kind of question that can change the way you walk into work tomorrow morning. Not because it fills your head with fantasy, because it forces you to see what is actually true. The rule that quietly changes everything is simple. Before 59 and a half, most withdrawals from traditional retirement accounts come with a 10% early withdrawal penalty on top of ordinary income tax. Yes, there are exceptions. There are special cases. There are people who can use the rule of 55. There are disability situations. There are medical exceptions. But for most people, before 59 and a half, that money feels sealed off. You can see it, you can count it, but using it feels expensive. Then you hit 59 and a half. And for most traditional IRAs and 401ks, that 10% penalty disappears. Not the taxes, I want to be very clear about that. The taxes do not disappear, but the penalty does. And that means your retirement accounts stop behaving like locked boxes and start behaving like tools. That is a profound change because the opportunity is not merely that you can now pull money out. The opportunity is that you can choose how money comes out, when it comes out, how much comes out, and what that does to your future tax bill. That is a different game. I have spent most of my life thinking about capital allocation. Most people hear that phrase and think about corporations, acquisitions, and balance sheets. But at 59 and a half, you become the capital allocator of your own freedom. Most people spend decades looking at their retirement accounts as a pile, a number, a someday balance. But once you cross 59 and a half, if you are thoughtful, that pile becomes a control system. Now you can start deciding whether to draw modestly from tax-deferred accounts while you are in a lower bracket. Now you can start deciding whether to convert pieces to Roth on purpose. Now you can start deciding how much earned income you even want to keep generating. Now you can start asking a more intelligent question than, can I retire? You can start asking, how do I unlock just enough of this money in the smartest possible way so I can buy back my time without overpaying the IRS? That is the real question. And once a person finally sees it that way, the entire emotional structure of working until 65 begins to weaken. Here is the first big mindset shift that catches people off guard. Your income after full-time work does not have to look anything like your income while you are still collecting a paycheck. When you are employed full-time, your income is rigid. It arrives in a familiar pattern. It is taxed in a familiar pattern. It pushes you through the year in a familiar pattern. There is not much design in it. It is salary, withholding, payroll, rhythm, repeat. But once you are past 59 and a half and no longer chained to a full-time paycheck, your income becomes flexible. That is the word people miss, flexible. You may choose to draw a modest amount from a traditional IRA. You may pair that with cash savings. You may use some dividends from a taxable account. You may decide to leave the Roth untouched 1 year and use it the next. You may work part-time for a season instead of full-time indefinitely. You may delay Social Security and bridge the gap in a more tax-aware way. In other words, retirement income is not one faucet. It is a system of faucets. I want you to picture 3 of them sitting over the sink. One is tax-deferred. That is the 401k, the traditional IRA. The money that has not been taxed yet, one is tax-free. That is your Roth money. One is taxable. That is the regular brokerage account, the bank cash, the pile you built outside the retirement wrapper. Once you are beyond 59 and a half, you get to decide how much to open each faucet. And that decision matters more than most people realize because what looks like the same amount of spending power can create very different tax outcomes depending on which faucet you use and when you use it. That is why so many people who say, "I still need my old salary," are not actually looking at the problem correctly. In retirement, you do not need to replace your job dollar for dollar in the same rigid format. You need to support your life. Those are not the same thing. If your spending is lower than your salary was, and if some of your income comes from sources taxed differently, and if you are no longer stuffing payroll taxes and commuting costs and work-related friction into your monthly life, the gap between what you earned and what you truly need may be far smaller than you think. That is one reason the years between 59 and a half and roughly 65 can be so powerful. For many people, those are not the most dangerous years. They are the most designable years. Before Medicare arrives, before Social Security is necessarily turned on, before required minimum distributions begin forcing money out later, there can be a stretch of years where your taxable income is lower, your choices are wider, and your planning opportunities are much better than they will be later on. That is where a lot of people make their biggest mistake. They keep working mechanically through the best planning window they are ever likely to have, and they do it because they are measuring the wrong thing. They are measuring the comfort of one more paycheck. They are not measuring the cost of losing control. Now let me take that one step deeper, because this is where the tax story becomes much more important than most people think. Recent law changes widened this planning window even further. Required minimum distributions do not begin as early as they once did. For many people, the forced distribution age is now 73, and for some younger people, it is scheduled to move even later. Why do I care about that? Because it means that if you are around 59 and a half, 60, 61, 62, you may have a very long stretch of years before the government starts forcing larger withdrawals out of your tax. Deferred accounts, that window matters. It matters because every year you intentionally move some money out on your own terms. Whether through a carefully sized withdrawal or a Roth conversion, you are reducing the amount that can later pile up inside those tax deferred accounts and come back to hit you at exactly the wrong time. People think the real danger is retiring too early. Sometimes the quieter danger is waiting too long without a tax plan. Because if those accounts keep compounding untouched while you keep earning a full-time salary, you may be postponing the problem into your 70s. When several unpleasant things can collide all at once, bigger required minimum distributions can push more income onto your tax return. That can push you into higher brackets. That can increase the amount you pay for Medicare through income. Related premium surcharges that can reduce your flexibility later. Right when you may have less patience, less energy, and less appetite for financial complexity. I do not want to say this gently, because it is not a gentle problem. A lot of hardworking people spend their healthiest years earning money, then spend their older years paying unnecessary taxes on money they were never forced to leave unplanned in the first place. That is not prudence. That is drift. The sweet spot is not mysterious. Fewer or no full-time paychecks coming in. Penalty. Free access to retirement accounts. No required minimum distributions yet. More room to shape the flow of money on purpose. That is the opening. That is the window. That is what age 59 and a half unlocks. Now let me say something many people do not want to hear. Working longer does not always make retirement safer. It can, of course it can, but not always. That is the lazy assumption a lot of people live inside. More years of work, more money saved, therefore more security. It sounds sensible, it sounds mature, it sounds almost impossible to argue with. And yet in real life, the math and the life experience do not always cooperate with that story. If you keep working full-time deep into your 60s, you may destroy your own lowest tax years. You may miss the chance to convert money to Roth while your bracket is lower. You may miss the chance to draw down some tax-deferred balances before future required withdrawals start stacking on top of Social Security and everything else. You may also push more of your lifetime planning pressure into later years when the menu gets narrower, not wider. And then there is the cost that almost nobody values correctly because it does not show up in a spreadsheet. Your healthy years, I watch people work one more year, then one more year after that, then one more year after that, all under the banner of caution. But caution can become waste when it blinds you to timing. There is a difference between being 60 and being 75. There is a difference between taking the long trip while your energy is still high and talking about the long trip after your knees, your back, your stamina, or your spouse. Has health changed the equation? There is a difference between helping your grandkids while you can still move easily through the day and promising yourself you will do it later when later has become smaller. This is why the real question is not, can I squeeze a little more money out of a few more years of work? The real question is, what exactly am I giving up in exchange for those years? Am I giving up low tax planning years? Am I giving up strategic flexibility? Am I giving up healthier years of life? Am I giving up the ability to choose work instead of endure it? If your doctor looked at you and said, your healthiest 5 years begin now, would you automatically spend them in meetings you no longer care about just because the calendar says 65 sounds responsible? That question bothers people for a reason. Because deep down, many already know the answer. Now, the first fear that usually jumps into the room at this point is health insurance. And I understand that fear completely. For many people, this is the big wall. It is the sentence that stops the entire conversation before it starts. I would leave earlier, but health insurance would crush us. I would scale back, but I cannot lose employer coverage. I would stop, but the unknown feels too risky. That fear is real, but real fear is not the same thing as final truth. The useful way to approach health insurance before 65 is not emotionally. It is structurally. You price it, you model it, you compare it, you stop turning it into a fog monster. If you retire in your early 60s and buy coverage through the Affordable Care Act marketplace, the sticker price can look uncomfortable. In some cases, very uncomfortable. A couple can see meaningful premium costs before subsidies, especially at that age, but that is only the beginning of the analysis, not the end. Because if leaving full-time work lowers your taxable income, that lower income may make subsidies more favorable than people expect, and that interacts with the rest of the plan. It may lower the effective cost of coverage. It may create more room for Roth conversions while staying within a chosen bracket. It may alter the comparison between working longer and leaving earlier in a way that is much more balanced than the raw premium quote suggests. And after 65, let me tell you something else people forget. Medicare does not mean healthcare becomes free. It does not mean the problem disappears. Healthcare remains a major lifetime cost in retirement. Premiums, out-of-pocket spending, long-run unknowns. All of it remains part of the picture. So the honest conclusion is not health insurance before 65 means I am trapped. The honest conclusion is health insurance is a real line item that belongs inside a real plan. That is very different. Once you stop treating it like a mystery and start treating it like a variable, it loses some of its power to terrify you. The second fear is even bigger because it hides behind almost every retirement conversation. Do I really have enough? People ask that question as though there is a single universal number hiding behind the curtain, 1 million, 2 million, 25 times expenses. Some clean number that tells them yes or no forever. I do not think that way. Rules of thumb can be useful. They are not worthless. But too many people treat them like commandments when they should be treated like approximations. Enough is not just an account balance. Enough is a system. Enough is the combination of your spending, your tax structure, your withdrawal design, your healthcare costs, your Social Security timing, your flexibility, your housing reality, your debt load, your willingness to work a little or not at all, your spouse's choices, and your ability to think clearly about what kind of life you are actually funding. A couple with less money and a disciplined plan can be far more secure than a couple with much more money and no coherent strategy. Because confusion is expensive, clarity is powerful. When people finally see what their spending truly is, how much of it is essential, how much of it is optional, where the income can come from, how different accounts behave, what a lower income year means for taxes, and what delaying or taking Social Security might do, fear starts to lose its grip. Not because reality changed overnight, because vagueness was the thing scaring them. That is why I tell people that clarity is often more valuable than another random chunk of savings. More money with no plan often produces more anxiety. A clearer plan with enough margin often produces freedom. So let me give you a practical framework, because this is where the conversation stops being philosophical and starts becoming useful. If you are trying to decide whether full-time work still needs to own your life after 59 and a half, there are a handful of things you need to walk through. First, know your real spending number. Not the one you guess. Not the one that sounds disciplined. Not the one you say in casual conversation. The real one. Look at your bank statements. Look at your credit card statements. Look at the last 6 to 12 months. Separate the essentials from the lifestyle spending, housing, utilities, insurance, food, transportation, then travel, gifts, entertainment, hobbies, one-time noise, until you know what your life actually costs. Every retirement conversation is theater. Second, map your money by purpose, not just by account label. I want people to stop staring at a pile and start seeing time. How much is available in cash or near cash for the next 1 to 3 years? How much sits in conservative assets that could support the middle years? How much is in long horizon growth assets meant to work for you 10 years or more into the future? When people organize the money this way, the picture changes. They stop thinking, I have one intimidating mountain of assets. They start thinking, this part is for near-term stability, this part is for the bridge, this part is for long-term growth. That is a much more useful way to think. Third, use the years between 59 and a half and required minimum distribution age as a tax design window. That phrase matters. A tax design window, not dead space, not waiting room time, design time. If your earned income drops or disappears, what bracket would you actually land in? How much could you take from traditional accounts without creating an unnecessary tax bill? How much could you convert to Roth while staying inside a range you can live with? How much future pressure could you remove from the back half of retirement by being intentional in the front half? That is where real planning earns its keep. Fourth, decide your work style, not just your retirement date. This one is critical because people think in false binaries, full-time or nothing, career or void, grind or golf. That is childish thinking. The intelligent question is not merely on what date do I retire. The intelligent question is what level of work stress, structure, and earned income actually fits the life I want. Now, some people want to stop completely. Some want to consult, some want part-time work with lower stress, some want income, but not the old pace. Some want freedom first and money second. The point is that once you stop assuming your old salary must be replaced in full, you may discover that the gap between your current life and your preferred life is much smaller than you feared. Fifth, clean up the liabilities that reduce flexibility. High-interest debt entering retirement is poison. Credit cards, personal loans, expensive obligations that drain optionality, those need attention. Then there is the mortgage. I am not dogmatic about that because real life is more nuanced than slogans. Some people sleep far better with no mortgage. Some people are perfectly fine carrying one. The math and the psychology are not always identical. But the key is this. If debt is eating breathing room, then part of your late 50s and early 60s strategy may involve cleaning that up so your withdrawal needs later are lower and your choices are wider. Sometimes, after 59 and a half, a carefully planned distribution used intelligently can remove an expensive debt burden and improve the whole system. But it has to be coordinated with taxes and long-run consequences, not done emotionally. Sixth, coordinate Social Security, pensions, and portfolio withdrawals as one system. This is where a lot of money gets lost simply because people make each decision in isolation. They think about Social Security separately. They think about the IRA separately. They think about the pension separately. That is a mistake. Those decisions talk to each other. Claiming earlier or later changes guaranteed income. That changes how much pressure lands on the portfolio. That changes how much tax. Deferred money you may want to move in the years before benefits begin. That changes the shape of later required withdrawals. That changes the long-term after-tax outcome. When people see these pieces as one machine instead of three separate topics, the plan becomes much stronger. Seventh, and I do not want you to skip this because it looks soft, design the next chapter on purpose. Where are you going to live? What is a good day going to look like? What relationships matter? What projects matter? What would you regret delaying? What kind of work, if any, would still feel meaningful without owning you? Money supports that picture. Money is not the picture. And one reason so many people cling to full-time work longer than they need to is that they have not built a compelling vision of what comes next. All they know is the job. So leaving the job feels like falling into a hole. But when people finally sketch the next stage with some honesty, maybe a smaller house later, maybe more travel, while health still cooperates, maybe helping family, maybe lighter work on better terms, the fear begins to shrink because now the money has a mission. It is not just there to create abstract safety, it is there to buy a specific life. Let me make this concrete with a simple example. Call them Tom and Linda. Tom is 59, Linda is 57. They did what responsible people are told to do for decades. They saved, they kept going. They assumed 65 was the finish line because that was the number that sat in their minds like an unquestioned law. Tom kept telling himself the same sentence over and over, just one more year, then I will feel safe. That sentence is one of the most expensive sentences in personal finance because it sounds modest, it sounds cautious, it sounds wise, and sometimes it is none of those things. They finally sat down and forced themselves to do the work they had avoided. They measured real spending, they sorted the accounts by purpose, they looked at what withdrawals might look like in lower income years, they studied different Social Security timing choices, they looked at healthcare before 65. They stopped waving their hands and started building an actual map. What they found was not that they could recklessly quit and ignore reality. What they found was more important. They discovered they did not need Tom's full salary anymore. That is a very different discovery. They could cover the gap with a combination of moderate withdrawals, thoughtful tax management, manageable healthcare planning, and a version of work that did not require both of them to keep running at the old pace. Linda could work part-time for a stretch doing something she actually liked. Tom did not need to continue carrying the old load simply because that had been the default setting. And when he finally stepped away from full-time work earlier than he once imagined, what struck him was not just the money. It was the energy. He could feel the difference. The years he recovered on the front end were worth more than the spreadsheet had taught him to notice. That is the point I want to land. I do not want you to romanticize retirement, and I do not want you to fear it blindly either. I want you to evaluate it the way any intelligent investor evaluates a decision. What is the cost? What is the opportunity? What is the flexibility? What is the downside of waiting? What is the downside of moving too early? That is the discipline that matters here. I am not saying every person should stop full-time work at 59 and a half. I am not saying 60 is the magic number. I am not saying everyone is secretly done already. I am saying this, once you understand what that age unlocks: penalty, free access, a flexible tax window, more control over withdrawals, more room to design income, more opportunity to reduce future required distribution pain. You may discover that the old assumption about working until 65 was never a law. It was a habit, and habits are expensive when they go unexamined. So tonight, I want you to ask yourself a question, not tomorrow. Not when markets calm down, not when your coworker retires tonight. If I stopped full-time work at 59 and a half or 60, how much income would I actually need from my investments after accounting for cash savings, part-time work, healthcare planning, taxes, and the timing of Social Security to live the life I truly want? Not the life your neighbor performs, not the life a commercial sells, not the life fear whispers to you, the life you actually want. Because if you do not know that number, then you are not really making a retirement decision, you are obeying a script. And if you do know that number, and if the math supports more flexibility than you thought, then the conversation changes immediately. Now, you are no longer asking whether work has to keep controlling your life. Now you are asking what role work deserves to have. That is a stronger question. That is an adult question. That is a free person's question. Retirement is not supposed to mean working until your body forces the issue and then hoping the timing was efficient. That is not strategy. That is surrender dressed up as responsibility. The goal is to use money, tax timing, account structure, and clear thinking so that you can stop working the way you no longer need to work, while you still have the strength to enjoy what you spent decades building. That threshold shows up earlier for many people than they think. Age 59 and a half does not automatically tell you to walk out the door, but it does demand that you stop lying to yourself about what is possible. And once you see that clearly, a lot of you are going to understand something that changes everything. You may not be trapped anymore, you may just be unplanned.